The man who built the home improvement television industry was earning as little as $200 an episode, while the show he helped create was watched by 11 million people every week. When he found a way to change that, he was out the door inside of a year, replaced before the season was over. That man was Bob Vila, and what happened to him is just the beginning of a story that runs 47 years, spans 4 different hosts, touches 1 death, 1 historic retirement, and ends with a streaming giant spending nearly $100 million to keep the whole thing alive. By the time you reach the end of this video, you will understand exactly where every single person from this cast landed, and why the show outlasted all of them. Russell Morash had been making television in Boston for over a decade before This Old House ever aired. He had produced Julia Child's cooking shows and a nature series called Crockett's Victory Garden. He knew public television. He knew what worked, and in 1978, his original idea for a home renovation show had nothing to do with renovation at all. The concept, as Morash later described it, was to tour newly remodeled homes. Finished results, no process, no sawdust, no tools in hand. A real estate tour dressed up as programming. Clean, easy to film, no surprises. It almost made it to air that way. What killed that version of the show was the same thing that made the real version legendary. Morash was having a barn built on his suburban Boston property, and the carpenter he hired was a quiet, methodical man from Milford, Massachusetts named Norm Abram. What Morash noticed first, and what he talked about for years afterward, was that Norm had the smallest scrap pile he had ever seen on any job site. Every cut was precise, nothing was wasted. That one detail told Morash everything he needed to know. He invited Norm to help with the renovation of a rundown Victorian house in Boston's Dorchester neighborhood, with a WGBH camera crew filming the process. The show aired in 1979. It was an immediate success. And the format, filming the work as it happened, not after, became the template for an entire genre of television. But Morash still needed a face for the show, someone to stand between the camera and the craft. He found one in a Cuban-American contractor from Miami named Bob Vila, who had just won a national award from Better Homes and Gardens for restoring a Victorian house in Newton, Massachusetts. Vila got the job, and for a decade, he was This Old House. But here's the part that changes everything about what you just heard. By the late 1980s, Bob Vila had become one of the most recognizable faces on American television. The show had 17 million viewers at its peak. Vila was on magazine covers. He was doing interviews. He was, by any measure, a star.
And he was making somewhere between $200 and $800 per episode.
Public television does not pay like commercial television. PBS was built on the idea that programming should serve the public interest, not line the pockets of talent. Vila accepted that, at least for a while, but he was also a businessman, and he was watching endorsement opportunities walk past him every season. By the late 80s, Vila had quietly built a second income through commercial endorsements, and those endorsements were getting larger. In 1989, a New Jersey-based home improvement chain called Rickle Home Centers approached him to become their television spokesperson. Vila took the deal. The problem was that Rickle's direct competitor, Home Depot, was one of the primary underwriters keeping This Old House on the air. Home Depot saw Vila's Rickle commercials and pulled their funding from the show. Their lumber supplier, Weyerhaeuser, which had donated over $1 million a year to the program by that point, followed. PBS's funding model had just collapsed. Producer Russell Morash gave Vila a choice: drop Rickle or leave the show. Vila, who was earning roughly $500,000 a year in endorsements, compared to almost nothing on PBS, did not drop Rickle. News articles from the Time report, both that he was fired and that he quit. Vila himself later described it as being caught between a rock and a hard place. Steve Thomas replaced him within weeks, and one of the first things the cast noticed after Vila's departure was how different the dynamic felt. Multiple cast members said, on record, that the show had been heavily focused on Vila during his run. After he left, it became, in their words, more of an ensemble production. What happened next is the reason this story spread across the internet. Steve Thomas was not the obvious choice. When producers went looking for Vila's replacement, they screened more than 400 candidates. Thomas was a builder, a sailor, an author, and an adventurer. He had sailed a 43-foot wooden sloop from England to San Francisco, crossed the Pacific to learn ancient Micronesian starpath navigation from a master navigator in the remote island of Sitawal, and was in the middle of researching a book about his family's history in the Alaskan Arctic when the call came. He took the job, and he stayed for 14 years, longer than Vila, longer than almost anyone expected. Under Thomas, the show climbed to the top of PBS's most watched ongoing series list. He won the 1997-1998 Daytime Emmy for Outstanding Service Show Host and received 9 additional nominations. He and Norm Abram developed a genuine on-screen friendship, a combination of dry humor and mutual respect that viewers found impossible to fake. Thomas left in 2003. Unlike Vila's exit, this one was clean. No funding crisis, no corporate dispute. He simply felt, after 14 years on the same show, that it was time to move. He described his daily routine as having become monotonous, not a complaint, just an honest reading of where he was. He went on to host Renovation Nation on Discovery's Planet Green, which ran until its cancellation in 2010. He produced episodes for the History Channel. He built homes in Maine. He became a spokesperson for Habitat for Humanity International, focusing specifically on their Women Build and Builders Blitz initiatives. He now runs his own construction company, Steve Thomas Builders, out of Midcoast, Maine, where he lives with his wife. In 2022, decades after leaving the show, Thomas received a Lifetime Achievement Emmy for his work on This Old House. Most people who know this story stop here, but the real story starts right now. Kevin O'Connor did not come from television. He did not come from construction. He came from banking. After earning a history degree from Holy Cross and an MBA from Boston University, O'Connor worked his way up to senior vice president of the commercial real estate group at Bank of America. He was building a career in finance. Home improvement television was nowhere in his plan. What changed everything was a wallpaper problem. O'Connor and his wife had bought a fixer-upper and were working through the renovation themselves. They were fans of This Old House. In 2002, as the show was launching a brand new spin-off called Ask This Old House, a program where the crew made house calls to help real homeowners with specific repair problems, the O'Connors sent a letter asking for help with their wallpaper. The crew showed up at his house. A few weeks later, Kevin O'Connor received a phone call, not to come back as a homeowner for a follow-up visit, to become the new host of the show. Steve Thomas was leaving. The producers had spent months watching footage of O'Connor on screen during his house call episode and decided what they saw was what the show needed. He was approachable, genuinely curious, and completely unafraid of looking like he didn't know something, which, in a format built on teaching, is more valuable than looking like an expert. He took the job in 2003. As of 2026, he is still there. More than 20 years hosting the same show, a tenure now longer than Thomas's 14-year run and dwarfing Vila's original decade. He also hosts Ask This Old House, runs a podcast called Clear Story, and has written a book, The Best Homes of This Old House. In October 2025, O'Connor told reporters that because of the friendships he'd built on set, the work still didn't feel like work. And if you think that was surprising, stay with me, because this next part is why the whole story matters. No single person in the show's history is more synonymous with it than Norm Abram, and it almost never happened at all. His father, Louis Abram, was a carpenter. Norm's earliest memory of putting tools to work was Christmas Eve of 1958, when his father took him along to install hardwood floors. Not the traditional way, cut nails and a skill saw turned upside down on a milk crate. Norm was 9 years old. He spent summers and weekends after that, learning the trade alongside his father. When he enrolled at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, he chose mechanical engineering. The family goal was education, not the trades. He struggled with the theoretical coursework and hated the lecture halls. He switched to business. After college, he worked his way up through a New England construction firm, became a site supervisor, and in 1976 started his own general contracting company. In 1978, he got a job building a barn for a Boston television producer named Russell Morrish. Morrish was so impressed with Abram's precision, specifically that smallest scrap pile detail, that he invited him to be part of the original show the following year. Norm Abram appeared as the master carpenter on the very first episode of This Old House in 1979. He appeared on the show continuously for 43 years. During that run, he worked on more than 50 complete house renovation projects. He hosted 280 episodes of his own spin-off, The New Yankee Workshop, which debuted in 1989. He wrote 8 companion books. He became so associated with plaid flannel shirts, a trademark that show creator Morash established early on, that This Old House magazine once called him a reluctant plaid ambassador. One of the details that gets almost no coverage, from the moment Tom Silva took over as general contractor and freed Norm to focus purely on finish work, Abram quietly left behind a handmade piece of furniture at every single project house he worked on. A tradition that ran for roughly the last 2.5 decades of his time on the show. His personal favorite was an Inglenook he built for the Manchester house. Curved walls, built-in seating. He called it his all-time favorite project. On May 19, 2022, after 43 years and over 1,000 episodes, Abram announced his retirement. A 1-hour tribute special, The House That Norm Built, aired on PBS on October 3, 2022. In interviews leading up to it, Abram said his next project was something entirely new, boat building. Specifically, he wanted to build a replica of the Herreshoff 12.5, a classic small sailboat designed in 1914. He mentioned he would likely need to attend boat building school first, which he described as great. The number that came next, nobody who followed this channel expected it. Roger Cook was the show's landscape contractor for nearly 40 years. He joined the series in 1982, its second season, and became a full-time regular in 1988. He was soft-spoken, practical, and deeply knowledgeable, the kind of person who knew the answer before the question was finished. In 2018, viewers noticed something was different. Cook was appearing less frequently. He was moving differently. In June of that year, Cook released a statement to the show's audience, explaining that he had been dealing with several health issues that made performing on television more difficult. He said he was going to focus more time on his health and his family. He never disclosed what the illness was. He stepped away from the show entirely in 2020. In the years that followed, Jen Nawada, a landscape designer who had been joining the show periodically, stepped in as his full replacement on Ask This Old House. The transition was handled quietly, without fanfare, and without any public update on Cook's condition. On August 21, 2024, This Old House released a statement. Roger Cook had passed away after a long battle with illness. He was 70 years old. The specific nature of his illness was never publicly disclosed. Norm Abram released a statement through the show's production team. Tom Silva called him a great guy, always the first to get down and dirty in the mud. Executive producer Chris Wolfe said he remembered every lesson Roger taught him and that his own garden bore evidence of Cook's advice. Cook had started his own landscaping company, K&R Landscape, with his wife Kathleen in 1982, the same year he first appeared on the show. Kathleen died from cancer in 2010. Roger had continued working through that loss, through the health decline, through the quiet years away from the cameras. He never made a dramatic farewell. He never came back for a closing episode. He simply left, and 4 years later, he was gone. One phone call, one conversation. That's all it took to change the direction of everything. For most of its history, This Old House lived at the intersection of public television and home improvement culture. It was a PBS show. That identity, earnest, educational, produced for Boston station WGBH, defined it for decades. That identity started shifting in 2016, when Time Inc. sold the show to a private equity firm. In March 2021, the sale completed to Roku, the streaming hardware and platform company, for nearly $100 million. Every episode of This Old House and Ask This Old House became available free, with ads on the Roku platform. PBS retained air rights. The show itself kept producing, but Roku had larger plans. In September 2025, the company announced the first new English-language spin-off in the franchise's history, a 6-episode series called This First House, hosted by Zach and Camille Detmore. The show follows millennial and Gen Z families navigating the purchase of their first home, bringing in experts from real estate, mortgage, legal, and construction fields. It premiered on the Roku channel on April 27, 2026. The target audience shift is not subtle. This Old House built its identity on renovation, on the premise that people who already owned homes wanted to make them better. This First House is built on the premise that a generation of people who grew up watching home improvement television now can't afford to own a home at all and need guidance on every step of the process, from the offer to the first repair. Also in 2024, This Old House magazine, which had been in print since 1995, reaching nearly 6 million consumers a month at its peak, published its final issue. The brand that had expanded into print decades earlier quietly ended that chapter, at the same time it was opening a new streaming one. Tom Silva remains the show's general contractor in 2026, continuing a run that dates back to 1988. Richard Trethewey continues as the plumbing and heating expert. His father was also a plumber, and Trethewey has been part of the show since 1979. Kevin O'Connor is still the host. The core trio that has defined the modern era of the show is intact. Here's what the comments kept asking. And here's the answer they never got, until now. There is a detail in the history of this old house that explains why it has outlasted 4 different hosts, multiple ownership changes, the end of its own magazine, and the deaths of cast members, and is now being reinvented for a generation that grew up on streaming. The original concept was to show finished homes. Russell Morash nearly made that show. What made it work instead was showing the process, the cuts, the mistakes, the adjustments, the expertise of people who had done this for decades. And what made the process watchable was not any one person, but the combination. A quiet carpenter who left furniture in every house he touched. A host who had sailed across the Pacific. A landscape expert who started a company with his wife the same year he first appeared on screen. A banker who got the job because of a wallpaper letter. A first host who was earning $200 an episode and building a parallel career that would eventually pay him $500,000 a year in endorsements. Every person who passed through that show brought a version of the same thing. Not fame, not performance, craft. And when one of them left, fired, retired, or gone, the show found the next person who carried it. That is a harder thing to replace than a host. It is also, as it turns out, harder to kill. This old house is not a show about houses. It has never been. It is a show about the belief that knowing how to do something, how to cut a joint correctly, how to read a yard before you put a plant in the ground, how to run a pipe through a wall that will hold for 100 years, is a form of intelligence worth taking seriously. Every cast member who ever stood in front of that camera understood that, and that shared understanding is the reason the show has now survived longer than most American institutions. In 2026, it continues on 2 platforms. Kevin O'Connor is still hosting. Tom Silva and Richard Trethewey are still on set. This first house launched in April with a new generation of homeowners, a new pair of hosts, and the same underlying premise, that knowing how things work makes you more capable of building a life worth keeping. Norm Abram, at 76, is reportedly learning boat building, measuring twice, as always, before he cuts once. Roger Cook is gone. The magazine is gone. The original host was fired. 2 others quietly moved on. And the show goes into its 48th season, having outlasted every version of itself that came before. Here's the question. Do you think this show could have survived without Norm Abram? Or was he the one cast member who was genuinely irreplaceable? Leave your answer below.